So go ahead and take a seat. If you have any questions that you want to ask, go ahead and pop them into the Q&A, but we'll also do in-room questions if we have time. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to go hand it off to Angela now, who will be our guest presenter. Thanks, Angela.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for your interest in this session. So I'm Angela Sanguinetti. I'm a research environmental psychologist at UC Davis Energy and Efficiency Institute, as well as the Institute for Transportation Studies. I'm going to be sharing about the research that I'm leading for CalFlexHub, which is all about trying to understand what users' experience is with load flexible technologies. So since you're all here and you've been here all day, you're doubtless familiar with the background for this research and also this graphic for CalFlexHub. I think we should be counting how many times we see this graphic today. So California's got some lofty goals for load flexibility, and it's probably going to involve highly dynamic rates, so electricity prices that change hourly, maybe even more frequently. And the idea is that to take advantage of such dynamic rates and achieve California's goals, we need to have end uses across a variety of technologies and end uses be automated, have automated load flexibility. And this is, of course, what spurred the CalFlexHub project funded by California Energy Commission. So Berkeley Lab, along with 17 funded partners, have formed teams to, I should still be here, have 4 teams. Each team is focusing on a specific technology with load flexibility capability. And they're developing those capabilities, they're demonstrating them in field tests, and the technologies range really widely from smart thermostats to EV charging, energy storage, and control systems for district space conditioning equipment. And many of the projects include field demonstrations. My role is to lead user assessments for those field demonstrations, so to come alongside the technology teams and interview the users at the sites. So ideally, we'd be able to get all these end uses automatically responding to dynamic price signals and do it all in the background, without disturbing building occupants, so without having any negative impacts or much impact at all on users and anyone in the buildings. But is it really that seamless in practice? Can it be that seamless? And what kinds of user-centered strategies are needed to make this go well and to help with development of these technologies? So those are the questions that are driving my research. And then the way that we're going about these user assessments is we're talking to each technology team. We're trying to understand what their technologies are and what the field demonstrations are comprised of, and identifying with them who the users are. And we define users really broadly to include anybody who might be interacting with the technology in any way during the load flexibility testing, as well as anybody who could potentially be impacted by the load flexibility operations. Our interview questions are organized into a few topics. We're interested in assessing users' experience with any information or feedback that they receive about the load flexibility operations before, during, or after testing. Interested in users' interactions with the technology during testing, their perceptions of any changes in the equipment operations or energy services, as well as any other energy or non-energy impacts. And we're analyzing the data both by individual technology to understand user experience with load flexibility in the context of a specific technology, and also looking across the different technologies and field demonstration contexts to understand kind of more generalizable insights about what is user experience with load flexibility generally, what insights, cut across different diverse technologies. So far, we've conducted user assessments for 6 technologies, including multiple rounds of interviews in cases where the technology teams are doing multiple rounds of load flexibility testing. And we're currently working on a few others. They just keep coming. So 4 of the projects that we've assessed have tested load flexibility in the context of residential space conditioning and or water heating. And then the other 2 have tested load flexibility with controls integrated into building automation systems on university campuses. If you were in the last talk in this room, they talked about a couple of these. So one of them was a building nearby here that used MPC to control the HVAC rooftop unit for one building. I think just one floor on one building, and then the other was to control the chiller operations at a large central plant that controls the space conditioning, the cooling for an entire campus. You may note the small sample sizes that we have for some of these interviews. Some of the field demonstrations have small sample sizes, so we're trying to talk to as many folks as we can. And you'll also see there's quite a wide range of technology readiness, so the readiness for the products to come to market. And this kind of alludes to some of our limitations with the research. So we've got developing technologies, some in really early stages. So they may not be a good representation of what those technologies could look like when they do come to market. And that would, of course, affect user experience. It would make the user experience we're seeing during testing less valid if the technologies are still evolving a lot. Often the testing is limited in terms of duration and frequency, and the testing is of hypothetical price signals. So we can't completely get at some of the more naturalistic motivations that customers might have for agreeing to be in a program or adopt a technology, and their satisfaction with outcomes like bill savings. We're not expecting them to get those kind of outcomes. So. But despite these limitations, we're converging on some really robust findings when we're analyzing the data across all these diverse technologies and demonstration contexts. And the findings are also important because there's just not a lot of research out there on user experience with automated load flexibility. So we're building on that. I'm going to share our findings in terms of a few key takeaways that are, again, kind of broadly applicable across load flexible technologies. And they are relevant for future research and development. So we hope they'll be pretty broadly useful with relevance for industry program providers and researchers as they're continuing to develop and understand and shape the potential for load flexibility. So the first one is that it's really critical for user acceptance that load flexible technologies and devices and systems incorporate human-centered user interfaces. And this is an aspect that we've seen relatively underdeveloped across quite a few of the technologies for which we've done user assessments. So many haven't had those user interface components fully developed that a market-ready product would have in order to enable key user interactions and to inform users so they know what those interactions are. And I'll speak to that with some of these examples. So in our assessment of user experience with model predictive control, MPC, of chillers at the large university central plant, we interviewed plant operators responsible for operating and monitoring the chiller equipment. And this was a low TRL project, low technology readiness, so early development stages. The team developed an algorithm to control the chillers. They worked with the plant's controls software provider to add a widget to the building automation system, their management system. That's what you see here. That image is what they added to their system. But initially, the operators didn't have a kill switch to disable the MPC until a couple of the operators went into the cooling tower and a fan started running, and so did they, to get out of there because that's really dangerous if the fan is running while they're in there. So thus the addition of a kill switch, that's what you see on the first line, allow MPC control, yes. And not to pick on that project, that was just the most dramatic example we have had of a deficient user interface, but I could give you a lot of examples of other technologies where there just hasn't been that simple basic functionality of turning the equipment off or disabling the load flexibility operations. And it's, I think, very generalizable that most any technology that has load flexibility is going to need to have an affordance for some user at some time somewhere to turn it off, to disable it. And then also the operators and supervisor at this university chiller plant, they mentioned that they'd like some kind of forecasting information, even just kind of near-term forecast of what the MPC operations would be so that they could schedule equipment maintenance when, you know, the equipment's not running. And that's probably pretty generalizable too, to have some near-term forecast information so people kind of know what to expect, and it helps with transparency, which is really important. In our user assessment of households who received Ecobee thermostats and consented to load flexibility testing, some continued to use their new smart thermostat in the same way that they used their old thermostat, which was not really taking advantage of the scheduling functionality and just turning it off and turning it on, turning it on when they wanted cooling or heating and then turning it off. But if the thermostat was off, no signal was received for the load flexibility testing, so that potential wasn't achieved. And I don't think we know enough about how people use smart thermostats. Smart thermostat companies may know this, but it'd be good to know how common that is, that people are using their thermostats that way, because that has implications for the potential of load flexibility in this context. And the images you see here are of Ecobee's Eco Plus feature, which the technology team kind of co-opted for their load flexibility testing. So these Eco Plus settings, controlled on the user's smartphone app, they're designed to inform how the thermostat behaves for TOU pricing and DR events. And the team used these settings to inform the degree of pre-cooling or preheating and setbacks for the load flexibility testing. But none of the users that we interviewed understood this explicitly, even though the technology team had communicated it. And had they understood this, some of them expressed to us that they would have modified their settings. So some would have increased their savings settings, so they would have had more load flexibility, and others might have decreased it only because instead they didn't know they could do that and they were overriding it frequently. So again, that would have meant more potential for the load flexibility. So some of this could have been because the interface wasn't designed specifically for the load flexibility project, and participants were instructed how to configure the settings for the study. So some of them expressed concerns like they didn't want to mess anything up. So not the most naturalistic, but the takeaway is just that optimally interfaces for these technologies need to be effectively informing users of the control that they do have over any parameters of the load flexible operations. Here's an example from a project that tested load flexibility with EV charging. Even though we didn't get to interview the users for this one, we asked the charger company if they'd had any changes in complaints during testing. They said no. Of course, there's potential for bias, but that's what we had for this one. There has been a lot of research, relatively speaking, in this area, looking at how to get people to accept some flexibility with EV charging, at least in the workplace. And you can see this kind of straightforward interface that lays out the parameters where the users do have control. Tell us how many miles you need and when you're leaving, and we'll make sure you have that, is essentially what it's communicating, which works well for people going to work and going to school. They have predictability of when they're going to leave. Now, anecdotally, we've heard this may not work. An interface like this may not be sufficient for home charging. People kind of want to have a little more spontaneity in when they leave. So the load flexibility might be a little more disruptive in that context. We haven't had a chance to interview folks for home charging projects yet. Moving on to the next takeaway, users across the diverse technologies expressed a desire for some feedback. How did the testing go? What did it accomplish? Or hypothetically, what would it have achieved? And this is consistent with other research in this area of user experience with automated demand response. The content of the feedback that they should be getting should reflect whatever the value proposition is for them. So what motivated them to participate in load flexibility? Ideally, they'd get feedback to confirm and substantiate that value proposition. This is something that could also come through a user interface, or it could be communicated by the program providers. Another note related to user interfaces and feedback. This was really interesting. I mean, so unsurprisingly, users are very different in their preferences. That's not surprising, but when it came to their preferences for engagement with the technology and the interfaces, even among early adopters. But for example, here's two quotes. These are from the same field test, so same technology. There were only 2 households in this one. It was the Harvest Thermal heat pump for space heating and water heating. So the question was, what features would they want to see in the app? Harvest Thermal is developing an app for their customers. And one wanted just about every feature under the sun, feedback and control. And then the other one didn't want to use an app at all. And this was a really passionate environmental advocate. She was in her 80s. really fun to talk to. But she begrudgingly even had a smartphone at all, so she didn't want to use the app. So even with a sample size of just 2, we kind of saw the full range here of possible preferences for an app. But the other thing that was interesting was just a kind of a disconnect between what people were telling us they wanted. People said they wanted more information, but they often hadn't engaged with what information was provided by the technology teams. They hadn't thoroughly read the emails that came in. They hadn't, really engaged with it. But then they expressed to us that they were curious and wanted to know. And I think part of that could be that issue of underdeveloped interfaces, and not having the information at their fingertips at the point in time where they were having an interaction with the technology and wanted to know more, and have it, simply designed and all that. But the other element is probably psychological, just wanting that transparency, wanting to know that should they want visibility into what's happening, should they need to take some control of it, that they would have affordances for that. So again, transparency and perceived control are key here. And then finally, in our user assessments, we also had glimpses of some interesting potential unintended consequences of load flexibility that could arise. So one household with an integrated heat pump, um, during testing, they described that they thought, they at least perceived that the water was hotter, or there was more ample hot water towards the end of the morning preheating period. And they were actually starting to delay their showering and going to work until later because they wanted to take advantage of what they perceived to be hotter or more ample hot water. And suspected that one of their children was also taking longer showers, because of because of during the testing. And then actually the same household, when the testing was going on with cooling, um, the interviewee suspected that her children were less tolerant of the higher temperatures. So during the testing where they had a period of pre-cooling followed by a setback, because the temperature was ranging more, getting cooler and then warmer, she thought that that might be making them a little less tolerant to the higher temperatures. So that's something that's really interesting that could be explored more, because the preheating and pre-cooling and the setbacks is kind of where it's at when we're talking about load flexibility with space conditioning. Another issue with the water heating, for the integrated heat pump project was noise. So the participant didn't want the water heater running at night because it was noisy and it shared a wall with the bedroom and kind of vibrated the whole thing. So understandably. So these things that maybe we're not thinking about when we're designing the algorithms, could be pretty important. And finally, perceived control. So at the chiller plant, the operators were really very anxious when they didn't have just the kind of direct and absolute control that they typically have over the chilling, the equipment. I think it's kind of like if you're used to driving a manual transmission car and then you have an automatic all of a sudden, and what do you do with your hands and things? It's just you're used to having more control, and it's a heavy responsibility when you need to make sure that the whole campus is getting adequate cooling. So um, issues like that, I think, are pretty interesting for load flexibility. So those are some insights, and we're continuing to get more as we get more user assessments done. And I want to thank my team helping to do this research, and encourage you, please get in touch if you're interested in tracking our progress or hearing more. We do also have a paper from the recent ACEEE conference about this research. And happy to do questions now as well. Yeah.
I'll come back there with the microphone. Sorry. I just want to make sure people online.
You don't actually need the amplification, but thank you. For speaking in the context of the chiller plant project and any other, I'm speaking here particularly of commercial plants or central plants, not so much with residential users, but where you're dealing with professional operators. Were any of them involved in the design or specification of the systems that they were ultimately going to be testing? Was there any opportunity for them to give input into the system before they were faced with actually using it?
Yes, definitely at the supervisory level, communications with the technology teams, not so much at the operator level. And that was something both the operators, I think even more so the supervisors, brought up, that there could be more communication in that way up front to kind of, there were, rules of thumb that had been grandfathered in that maybe the operators didn't know weren't that important, and they were watching things happen that they thought went against what they were supposed to do. So communication was great, don't get me wrong, but there was a room for improvement, I think, in bringing the operators in more.
Thanks, Angela. Armando Casillas, Lawrence Berkeley Labs. I'm wondering, you had shown that screenshot of the BAS kind of tool, and I know, for instance, like Ettore, you can maybe speak to this. Like, is this pretty similar in terms of what you guys had as well, right? I wonder how much of this has, like you mentioned, it's nice to have a kill switch. I'm wondering how much of this is a subject of, or a function of, what's the capabilities of the software there, that the building automation system or what have you can actually can do on this, or how much of it is actually a function of, the needs of the operator, right? And in terms of a building automation system, I mean, there's only so much you can do in terms of customizing the menu. But then, how much of that falls on, maybe the researcher, or how much of it actually falls on the OEM that's providing the software itself. I'm wondering if you have any insights in that as well.
Yeah, I think you probably have better thoughts on that once you're so familiar with this area. But I think that that's one of the tricky things is with these developing technologies, when it's still in the hands of researchers, you guys are worried about like functionality and like, can this technology work? And then if it were to go to market, someone else would be coming in and kind of worrying about, I think, some of those user-facing things more. And I don't really have anything to say about who should do it. There's probably different models.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think what I'm trying to get at a little bit with this is, there's maybe software that is maybe more user-friendly than a building automation system menu. I mean, if anyone's ever looked at one of those things, I mean, some of them are still stuck in the 90s, right? Yeah. Well, actually, we're actually getting to the point where that actually looks cool. I don't know if you've seen any Gen Z, Gen A,
It's
Gen
retro.
Alpha. I mean, the 90s are cool, so maybe that's flashy now. But I think it's something to think about in terms of like software solutions that are more user friendly, that have that functionality, right? Maybe it's not the BAS. Maybe we need a layer on top of that, and it's something that we can maybe kind of workshop among the folks here that are familiar with these environments. Anyway, I just wanted to kind of
no, that would be
throw that out
great.
there.
And I do think even the operators, it seemed like, didn't know the whole BAS all that well, because I think they were just one menu tab or something away from getting some information that some of them were asking for. They, from what I could discern from the interviews, it sounded like they had a little more historical information on NPC operations they didn't know was there in their interface, because they probably just work in the one screen.
Yeah, well, I want to follow up on that. This is Gwelyn Polyaga, TRC. I wanted to ask a similar question to Armando, but I'm going to bring it back to this load flexibility user interface topic to keep it on track. I think those of us like Armando and I that have been working in building automation systems for a long time, have recognized and identified that usability and user interfaces is a huge challenge and problem, and we're stuck in the 90s or even before. And seeing lots of failures of even high technology readiness level solutions because the operators and users can't interact at the right level. And so my question for load flexibility is, what have you encountered this in any of these other assessments, or thought about whether like the sophistication and complexity of this technology is, like whether the market's adequately addressing it, because we know for sure building automation system user interfaces are incredibly far from capable of meeting the user where they need to be met, because they can't even meet these simpler technologies. So is that a theme that's come up at all about like the, UI, UX being ready for this level of sophistication?
So it's definitely a theme. I'm not really familiar with BAS UI, and I think that might sort of be related to the problem because I do UI related research and user experience, and it's probably there's a kind of a divide probably because it's so technical. So I think, and this probably isn't going to answer your question, but I think one of the keys is to get behavioral research, behavioral science, and UI UX expertise in on the ground floor of developing technologies so that you can kind of design something as simply as possible from the get-go, if that makes sense.
Just as sort of a follow-up on this kill switch. Sort of traditionally a challenge has been that once something is turned off, it's very hard to get it back on. So just sort of wondering again, what the intent really is of that kill switch. I mean, is it that we set back on state, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that varies for the different technologies. So for this one, it was a disable and then enable when you're ready. And the purpose for it was if they needed to go do maintenance in a cooling tower or something, where they needed to be sure that the equipment wouldn't run, that's when they would disable it. But then there's other contexts where like some of the smart thermostat ones, if people override it, then they're done for the rest of the day. And there's kind of a balance. And I don't know how teams have thought that through of like, if they override it, do we have it kick back on automatically in a couple hours or the rest of the day? And I don't know that we know kind of the sweet spot for all that. Therese.
Thanks. This is great. Bringing back to residential, just wanted to know your thoughts about so for example, water heaters, heat pump water heaters.
Mm-hmm.
What about the population that doesn't have internet? English is not their first language. A tenant moving out, and you can only connect these things if you have internet. Do you have any thoughts about that situation?
I do. I don't know how practical they are, but my favorite kind of interfaces are kind of the simple, can you build things into the environment that aren't electronic? I don't know if have you seen the little Canary air quality monitor that you just hang on the wall and it flips upside down when there's too much CO2? I haven't even mounted it yet. I just got it the other day. And then it flips back up. So super simple, just in the ambient environment. You don't need an app. There is no app. So I wish we could figure out how to do more things like that. And that would definitely make it more accessible to all kinds of different populations. Thank you so much for taking us right up to lunch. 12:30 on the
All right, we're right at 12:30. Thanks, Angela.